Hi everyone, this is my Unit 3-4 review for AP World History. Much like yesterday, I want to go through and describe our big topics for Unit 3 and 4. Unit 3 is all about land-based empires from 1450 to 1750, and so we'll talk about expansion via land, how that happens and who exactly does it and who's impacted by it. In addition, Unit 4 is also going to talk about expansion, but this is going to be transoceanic connections, and so we'll talk a lot about those sea-based empires, and again, who is going to be doing it and who is affected by it. The first group that we are going to talk about is China. When we talk about China, again, this review sheet that I have been using with you guys throughout is going to discuss two dynasties. We're going to talk first about the Ming Dynasty, which is addressed in Chapter 13 of your Strayer textbook and your notes. And then we will also be talking about the Qing Dynasty. Again, moving towards the Ming Dynasty, which is our first one, and they are going to rule from the late 1300s throughout the early 1600s. This is really a recovery time for China from Mongol rule or from the Yuan Dynasty, and so we're going to see them go back to a lot of our traditional Chinese values, specifically with Confucian learning. This includes reestablishing that civil service exam, as well as creating or reestablishing the centralized government with an emperor as your authority or as your ruler. The one specific ruler that you should remember for the Ming Dynasty is Emperor Yongle. He is the one who is going to reintroduce the tribute system. And again, the tribute system is not necessarily where the Chinese want to go and conquer other civilizations nearby. However, they do want to establish political and economic control in terms of that they are allowing other groups to come in and trade within China, but it is by Chinese means, or it is by Chinese agreement. And so a lot of times, like we have said before, is that the Chinese are going to give so much more back to these groups, but it's really for these groups to acknowledge that the Chinese are superior during this time. The one person who's really going to be a standout for Emperor Yongle in doing so is a man named Zheng He, who is a court eunuch for Emperor Yongle during this time. And so he's going to take his small ships or fleets and go to surrounding islands around the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia and reestablish this tribute system. After Emperor Yongle dies, however, this tribute system is going to be done. Many within China are thinking that they are very self-sufficient or they have these superior goods. They have enough, they have many people to trade with, that there's not really any worth in expanding further. They don't need any new resources or going and exploring any new places. Again, they really wanted to focus on their age of prosperity or really focus on their arts and their literature. And so this is where we see the Ming Dynasty. You could talk about how this is going to hurt the Ming Dynasty in the long run in terms of because they are not expanding. Again, they're not making those connections with other people, and thus they're not going to see those new resources from the New World that eventually the Europeans will. However, as we talk about the Ming Dynasty, we will see that the Ming Dynasty really starts this trading with specifically Spain for silver. This is one resource that China does not have and is not able to get a hold of. They will get some silver from Japan, but not as much because remember, Japan is going to, stingy is the wrong word, they are going to be very frugal with who they are going to give their silver to because it is considered very valuable and they don't want to hurt their environment during this time. So again, Spain is really the big pusher of silver during this time, going to those ports of Manila, the Philippines, and then trading with China. Because China really wants silver during this time and they have this heavy emphasis on consolidating all of their currency into silver, you're going to see that taxes are paid in silver during this time, as well as people are going to sell their goods in terms of how much silver can be paid for said good. You are also going to see this idea of the collection of silver then continue throughout our Qing Dynasty, ultimately leading to the inflation of silver and the downfall of the Qing Dynasty economically. When the Ming Dynasty falls again around that mid 1600 time period, around 1644, you are going to see the rise of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty is going to be much more focused on their land-based empire, so expanding west into what we know as China today, and those western portions are what we used to call our central oasis cities. And this is really, again, going to be driven by the nomadic threats that were occurring not only from groups such as the Mongolians, but others, or what I always consider those pesky nomads. And when they did this, they didn't assimilate, or they did not have those that they acquired then be taught those Chinese ways. They usually had local elites or local officials who would govern those areas that they expanded into. But again, they did not by any means want to assimilate them because they felt like the Chinese culture was superior. Because of this growth of their empire during this time, we're also going to see how this growth of a population is going to put a lot of pressure on the government, which is going to be one of their downfalls later in the 1900s. That is your Chinese empire, again, going from talking about those transoceanic connections with the Ming dynasty to the land-based empires with the Qing dynasty. The next group that I want to talk about starts talking in chapter 13, but moves their way through 13, 14, and 15, because we're really going to blend together this idea of transoceanic connections and land-based empires. When we talk specifically, or first, I guess, about transoceanic connections, recognizing that our groups who are going to be the first to go and explore, and really with those motives of God, gold, and glory, are going to be the Portuguese, and then the Spanish. The Portuguese are mainly going to go and establish themselves through trading post empires. These trading post empires are going to first off be state sponsored, but really they want control of trade and trade routes. They necessarily don't want to establish themselves or having to rule over certain territories politically. So really, again, this is an economic motive that they have. And the Portuguese are considered superior during this time specifically because of their ships and their cannons or the military that they have, so they're allowed to do this. When the Spanish come in, they ultimately are going to push the Portuguese out and establish rule there. The best place to know or be able to talk about Spanish rule in Southeast Asia is going to be in the Philippines, specifically with that city, port city, Manila. Again, you'd recognize or talk mostly about this when we talk about the silver trade coming from the New World. However, we want to know that this established colony of Spain is really going to have a heavy emphasis on slavery or unpaid labor, as well as those taxes that the Filipinos are going to have to pay, in addition to the integration of Spanish, specifically Spanish missionaries, which leads to a high conversion rate to Christianity. This, again, is going to be a state-sponsored exploration and conquest, different than the next group that I am going to talk about, which is our joint stock companies of the Dutch and the British. When we talk about joint stock companies, we are talking just, again, the word joint meaning multiple, and stocks, we are talking about pooling or putting your money in to something that you hope will succeed. So again, these are private investors who are putting their money in. They have that money, that means to put their money into these businesses. And so if these businesses do really, really well, those private investors will get their money and more back. But if these businesses do really, really poor, those private investors are going to be losing money. Because it is private investors, again, they are going to find their own means or that money to then go and control trade within, for the Dutch, Indonesia and the spice trade, and then the English or the British are going to monopolize Indian textiles. When we talk about the Dutch being in Indonesia, remember that this is going to completely devastate the local economy here, as well as the Dutch are really going to establish themselves politically and have complete political control as well as economic over that production and shipping of the spices. When we talk about the English, we're really talking about how the English are going to weasel their way into India. The Mughal Empire, so remember that Muslim group, is going to be ruling within India, specifically the northern parts of India during this time period. And so it starts off with the English negotiating for trading within port cities and then eventually taking over complete control of India. But again, they are really emphasizing here the trade of Indian textiles. The reason why, and this would be great for talking in terms of contextualization if you are going to be doing a DBQ about trade during this time period, is contextualizing or giving your reader the, well, why were people able to do this during this time period, or some of those advantages that the Europeans are going to have. The biggest reason why Europeans are able to do this during this time period is going to be new technology. Specifically, when we talk about like the Portuguese and the Spanish, that they have the capabilities due to their caravels or their smaller fleets of ships that are then using the lateen sails that allow them to move these sails in the direction that they are choosing to go, despite those like monsoon winds within the Indian Ocean. So again, new technology is a big piece of why Europeans are allowed or have this advantage to do this during this time, and that would be something you could address in contextualization. You could also address the geographical proximity piece. Now, this is going to be more important when we talk about why Europeans are going over to the Americas during this time or how they get established themselves there. Another big piece that I would talk about, depending on how your prompt is worded, is you could also talk about the competition between these newly formed European states, as well as their competition with the Ottoman Empire, or really that tension they have with the Ottoman Empire. So remember that our 1450s is really where Western Europe starts to consolidate and create a lot of the states that we know now, such as Spain, Portugal, France, Great Britain, so on and so forth. And each of these states is trying to make a name for themselves. When they are trying to make a name for themselves, it not only includes what's happening internally, but what are they trying to prove externally? And that's really where the establishing of those outside empires comes into play. In addition, many of these places are going to be some form of Christian. We're not going to get into the whole Protestant versus Catholic yet, but again, many of these places are going to be Christian. They don't want to have to go through the Ottoman Empire before. When they used to go through the Ottoman Empire, they used to have to pay heavier taxes, as well as rely on Muslims. And again, with that religious tension, that was not something that they wanted to do. And so this started first with a guy named Vasco da Gama, who's going to sail around the Cape of Good Hope or the southern portions of Africa, making his way eventually to India, and then establishing trading networks from there. This allows then other Europeans, such as Christopher Columbus, to want to go and explore different or new ways in order to get to India. And so he is going to then explore via going west and runs into the Caribbean or runs into the Americas, and that sets off exploration in what we consider the New World. That's going to set my shift of talking about what's happening in the Americas prior. So again, we have first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, then the Dutch and the British, who are all going to be involved in some way, shape, or form in trade in the Indian Ocean Trade Network or Southeast Asia. When we talk about trade in the New World, you're going to see many of those people, as well as the French, who are also going to be involved here. Ironically, we're again going to see that the Portuguese are going to be first, along with the Spanish. And then eventually, and who gets really the leftovers of the New World, specifically North America, is going to be the Dutch and the British and the French. When we talk about the Americas prior to colonization, we talk about two groups who existed, the Aztecs and the Incas. The Aztecs are defined by their loosely structured government, so we do not talk about how they are going to have an absolute monarchy with a bureaucracy or a centralized government by any means. So loosely structured government. One thing that is a standout for their government is they are highly militarized, and therefore they are going to conquer those around them. When they conquer those around them, the conquered are required to give tribute to the Aztec state. In addition, the Aztecs are seen as a very organized people in terms of trade, and so you're going to see a lot of markets that are developed during this time within cities such as Tenochtitlan, and so you're going to see different people from different parts of that empire who are then going to go and trade. When they do conquer these people, they are not assimilating them by any means, and some of these people, because we talked about this prior, some of these people may even be sacrificed because this was a prominent practice due to the Aztec religion during this time. The Incas, on the other hand, remember the Aztecs in Mexico, Incas, on the other hand, are going to be in Peru. Because Peru is very long and skinny, we need an efficient way of communication, and this includes an efficient government in order for the Incan Empire to grow. When they go and conquer other people, they are going to assimilate them into their population, as it is a welcoming format. In addition, you are going to, like I said, see a stronger government in terms of having a bureaucracy as well as an absolute leader. You could also talk about other things, such as how they are going to have an efficient way of communicating through their kipu, and you could talk about their agricultural systems or things like that as efficient ways to help their empire grow. One similarity between both the Aztecs and the Incas is going to be this term called gender parallelism or gender pluralism, which is really this idea of separate but equal. So both men and women have separate roles within society. However, each gender knows that the other gender is needed, as well as their role within that society, in order for it to flourish or work. So again, that's that idea of gender pluralism. When specifically the Spanish come over, the Spanish are going to conquer both of these areas. Hernan Cortez is the conquistador who will conquer the Aztecs, and Francisco Pizarro is the conquistador who will conquer the Incas. When they do this, remember, they take them over. Initially, many of those natives are going to get wiped out from what is called the Great Dying, or ultimately because of the spread of disease that a lot of Native Americans were not immune to because they had been blocked off from trade. Remember, we really think about like Old World and New World. The New World had not come into contact with diseases such as the Black Plague. And so because of that, when people from the Old World came over, they had this immunity that had built up, and maybe they were carriers of some of these diseases that the New World had not experienced, thus this Great Dying. In addition, you are going to see not only a high depletion of natives, but a new integration and high integration of people from the Old World, specifically from Spain and Portugal. When we talk about Spain and Portugal, remember, because their purpose is God, gold, and glory, you are really only going to see men who are coming over to make a name for themselves, establish Christianity, specifically Catholicism, and discover this new land. Because of this, you're going to see an integration of the men into the society in terms of making babies. And so you're going to see a very elaborate and complicated social structure in South America compared to what you will in North America. So this is where we've gone through several times and talked about your peninsulares who are at the top, your Creoles, your Mestizos, mulattoes, natives, and Africans. And really, for the first time in history, as we talk about slavery, we're associating slavery with a skin color or an ethnicity, which was not really done prior. It was more about conquered people or who was owed a debt. In this term, it's based on your skin color and how people are then going to view you from there. On the flip, when we talk about North America is not going to see this intense slavery. Again, about 80% of the slaves who come over from Africa are going to go to the Caribbean and Brazil, or to these Latin American regions. The reason why they're not going to go to North America is when people, specifically from Great Britain, but also the Dutch and the French, come over to the New World, you're going to see a lot of women and families who move with the men, usually for means of religious freedom, but also political freedom. And so because of that, there was not a lot of racial mixing, and therefore a more sharply defined racial system, in really which case it was like whites, natives, and Africans. Because of these families coming over, you also had much smaller family farms that were used for self-sufficiency. So there was really no need for slave labor compared to those plantations and mines that the natives and Africans are going to work in South America. The last thing when we talk about Europeans coming over in North America is emphasizing not only are they going to come for those that they are going to come over and establish self-sufficient farms, but you are also going to see some who are going to use the fur trade with the natives as a means economically then to trade with the Old World. When they do this, remember that there's going to be a heavy reliance by the natives then on some of those goods, such as guns and alcohol, that then come out of this trade for fur. When we talk about economics with South America, one of the big emphasis that we want to hear, what I would like to see you discuss when we talk about economics in South America, is that silver trade. Again, specifically the Spanish are going to be using that silver from South America to trade with China because China required people to trade with them during this time. In addition to that, you're going to see a high slave population who also has to work on plantations, specifically sugar plantations during this time. One example could be in Haiti that you talk about, as well as other places within South America. You're going to see high abuse of these slaves. Again, very poor working conditions, as well as that they were really seen as dispensable, or like, hey, if slaves did die during this time, that they were just going to go and get more from Africa. And that's really where we then move into talking about what's happening in Africa during this time. So this was our time of our transatlantic slave route, again, that connection between Europe, Africa, and the New World. When Europeans would want to trade with Africa during this time, they were not themselves as Europeans going into the interiors of Africa and then gathering Africans to then sell. You had tribe against tribe within Africa who were fighting, or debtors, like I said before, who were then being sold off to these Europeans. Europeans in turn would bribe or trade African merchants and elites for many goods such as guns, which then left certain tribes superior to others. This really marginalized certain groups within Africa, but also had some other effects such as slowing down their population as well as slowing down economic growth in Africa, because again, you are now going to have warring tribes against one another, and a good majority of your population, specifically of males, who are then going to be moving, or forced to move rather, who are then forced to move to the Americas during this time. So again, politically very fragmented. There's really no centralized powers, which allows the Europeans to do this. The next group that I really quickly want to go through before I finish up talking with the Islamic empires is Russia. During this time period of 1450 to 1750, again, our big emphasis is on transoceanic connections and land-based empires. The Russians do not have any transoceanic connections during this time. They are not going and exploring themselves. They're not trading via the waterways. They really just only have those land-based empires. And when we talk land-based empires, they are expanding into Siberia. This is where Russia is going to be centralizing, specifically around the city of Moscow during this time. And it's a time period when Russia is looking to become European, essentially, or they want to be closer to Europe in terms of trade, and they want to mimic Europe in terms of that political structure that they are then following. And so Russia is going to have an absolute monarchy, and again, they really want to establish themselves within trade. Fur is really only coming from the New World during this time, and so this is seen as a competitive market. The Russians are going to get much of their fur from this newly conquered area in Siberia, as well as some other minerals, and thus this allows the Russians to be seen as a political and economic power during this time, because they are able to then trade with Europeans, other Europeans, for what the Europeans consider a valuable good. When the Russians go to Siberia, keep in mind that they are not only going to be trading economically, but also culturally. And so you're going to see a high conversion of Siberians to Russian culture in terms of language, but also Christianity, specifically that Eastern Orthodox conversion. So that is Russia in a nutshell. The very last section that I want to talk about is the different Islamic empires that exist during this time. So the three Islamic empires that I really am going to touch home on are the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and then the Mughal Empire. Keep in mind you also have the Songhai Empire within Western Africa, and again, we have talked before about Islam being established in Western Africa, mainly among urban elites, so I'm not going to go any farther than that. Just know that they are still there. When we talk about established Muslim empires or Islamic empires during this time period, 1450 to 1750, the big one you want to remember are the Ottomans. The Ottomans are going to exist from about 1299 all the way through World War I and even after, until the early 1920s. The Ottoman Empire is known for their expansion during this time period we are discussing, 1450 to 1750. And one guy in particular, his name is Suleiman the Magnificent. He is going to help consolidate and grow the military during this time, as well as expanding in the arts. So some of the things that we talk about with the Islamic Empire during this time period is going to be in terms of math and science. And again, their basis for these two discoveries, or these exploring these two areas, is really going to be around the Islamic religion as well. You'd consider this, with Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans' golden age, again, this age of peace and prosperity. When we think about the Ottoman Empire reaching their extent, it happens during this time where you're going to see the Ottomans go throughout all of northern Africa. In addition, they're going to make their way through the Byzantine Empire, what was the Byzantine Empire, up to Greece. And then we are also going to see them expand to Persia, or where that Safavid Empire is in modern-day Iran. You will have religious tolerance throughout the Ottoman Empire, specifically with Christianity, although many are still going to convert to Islam because it is the religion of the Ottoman Empire during this time. When we talk about the Safavid Empire, really the big things that you need to know is this is the pesky little brother of the Ottoman Empire. When we talk about the Safavid Empire, we're really talking about Shia Islam, that idea of mosque and state being completely combined through Sharia law, and how they are going to be the buffer zone between China and the Ottomans. Like we've said prior, the Ottomans could pretty much annihilate the Safavid Empire, but they don't, mainly for being that buffer zone between the Ottomans and China, or what were considered non-Islamic beliefs. The last group that we want to talk about here is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is going to be based in modern-day India, specifically in the northern portions. They leave that bottom little triangle alone. They come in and they establish themselves for about 200 years. The two main people that you want to remember with the Mughal Empire, specifically when we talk about like Sunni Muslims, is one man in particular. His name is Akbar. He's considered the greatest emperor of the Mughals of the Mughal Empire. He is going to accommodate a lot of the beliefs that had been there prior. Remember, India is really unique when it comes to the Mughal Empire, or I guess prior to the Mughal Empire. India was fragmented forever up until the Mughal Empire, due to those local loyalties of the caste system. When the Mughals come in, because they are going to take a lot of the people from those lower castes, as well as Buddhists who felt on the outskirts, as well as some other groups, that this really helps them unify much of India that others could not prior. Akbar is then going to take this one step further and allow for religious tolerance. And so Akbar is going to allow for anyone, no matter what your religion is, to be a part of the government system. He's going to, like we read in our DBQ 2 or 3 weeks ago, he's also going to then go and learn about other religions from religious scholars of that particular religion. In addition, he's going to completely abolish the jizya tax. These all sound like great accommodating things in which you would love an emperor for doing during this time. However, his great-grandson had other ideas. You then are going to hear about another guy. His name is Aurangzeb. And again, Aurangzeb is the great-grandson of Akbar. Two very different men with very different ideas. Akbar is going to do the complete opposite of everything his great-grandfather did, including he's going to try to impose Islamic supremacy. This means that he's going to kick any Hindu or Buddhist out of government that once was. He is going to implement the jizya tax again. In addition, he is going to persecute Hindus and Buddhists to the point of burning down their religious places, their temples. So again, Akbar and Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb then is going to really make how do I want to say this? He is ultimately going to be the one who starts this discrimination or segregation against certain religious groups in India that is then going to continue on into the 20th century when we see that divide of India and Pakistan. And so that's kind of looking ahead with the Mughal Empire. That is pretty much all of Unit 3-4. The only other thing that I want to emphasize here, and this is something that you can always reach out about if you have questions, is there are cultural elements that go along with this, right? So we talked a lot about religion already, but understanding that the printing press is going to be invented during this time, during the 1600s, and this allows for a lot of these new ideas to spread, not only from our colonies, but also from people within Europe specifically. So this cultural movement is really an emphasis on challenging state and church authority during this time, as well as reestablishing this love for learning that was used within the classical periods with those people such as Socrates and Aristotle. And so you're going to see a focus again on religion, but what does religion necessarily mean for people, and how do I explain life without religion? And so you're going to see the Protestant Reformation, and that really emphasizes challenging of the Catholic Church, specifically within Western Europe. The Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, again, and the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment are really about this rebirth or this love for learning that occurs after the Black Death and people wanting to know things for themselves. If you have any questions about any of those, the Protestant Reformation, Scientific Revolution, or the Enlightenment, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, that's all I have for Unit 3 and 4. And again, that covers chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 in your Stir text. Bye.